Okay, I think we're recording. Yep, we are. Hello and welcome to episode 80 something, 83 of Question and Answer. I'm your host, Panyo Basa, and these are my co hosts, who both of which are in heat. So please just disregard it if they start doing anything inappropriate like humping each other. And we got a fair amount of questions today, so I might as well just dive right in. And the first question is from Nature Cure. And Nature Cure says, you consider Sotapanna and Sakadagami are not genuine enlightenment. That is very bold statement in my opinion. I watched all your previous videos answers about this topic. I still can't get satisfied with your answers. Can you please provide more insights, answers to this topic, or individual video on this topic with Brian or Ajahn Punadamo? Okay, well, there's a few things I can mention here, but I guess I'll get to the additional things I can mention towards the end. But yeah, it is. I think what he's referring to is the four stages of enlightenment, or the four stages of sainthood, the four stages of Ariyahood, which traditionally in Theravada or Sotapanna or stream enterer, Sakadagami or once returner, Anagami or non-returner, and Arahant or fully enlightened being. And I don't consider that to have originated with the Buddha himself. I do think that it was a later addition for two main reasons. One is that if you look at the texts, it just seems unlikely that in the older texts, when they're mentioning a Sotapanna, for example, they're mentioning somebody who has had a glimpse of enlightenment and is a kind of saint. Like in the Potty rules, there's reference to monks not relying too much on a family of Sotapannas. And it just means, probably just going with the context, that a family of Sotapannas is a family of new converts who have just entered the stream of Dharma, and it'd be sort of like the equivalent of a born-again Christian. Also, G.C. Pandey, in his book Studies in the Origins of Buddhism, which I would highly recommend to anyone who wants to understand what early Buddhism was like, points out that, for example, Sakadagami is a term that is not found at all in texts that show signs of great antiquity, like archaic features, like very early Buddhism, like even pre-Theravada Buddhism. Also, he points out that the Itivuttaka, the first several suttas of the Itivuttaka, the term anagami apparently is used in the sense of a fully enlightened being. And stop it. So, I mean, there is sort of internal evidence like that. And, I mean, the meanings of these terms, they're kind of fluid among different schools of Buddhism. For example, I read one of the cardinal Mahayana Buddhist texts. I can't remember which one it was. They had this weird interpretation of the four stages in that a Sotapanna, let's see, what was it? An Anagami, let's see, where should I start? Start at the top or the bottom. A Sotapanna was considered to be just an ordinary Arahant. That a Sakadagami was considered to be a Pacceka Buddha, if I remember correctly. And it was this weird thing. I read it years ago, but it was like an Arahant. Yeah, okay. Anyway, one of them meant Pacceka Buddha. I think it was a Sakadagami was interpreted to mean a Pacceka Buddha. What are you doing? Stop it. So anyways, the main point I'm trying to get to is that different schools of Buddhism had different interpretations of these four stages of sainthood. But for me, what is even more important is, I mean, that's just kind of conjecture based on circumstantial evidence, just the evidence tends to point in a certain direction, but you can't really be certain. But for me, the clincher is that I do not consider Theravada Buddhism or Buddhism in general to have a monopoly on enlightenment. That other spiritual traditions also can lead to full enlightenment. I think even some Christians may be fully enlightened or have become fully enlightened in the past, I should say. I don't know who I would point to nowadays as an enlightened Christian, but I do think that somebody like Meister Eckhart or St. John of the Cross may have been fully enlightened. And also a number of Greek Orthodox or just Eastern Orthodox monks and nuns. And Theravada Buddhism or just Buddhism is the only one that has these 4 stages of sainthood. So, if it's a thing that happens, that there are these 4 stages of enlightenment that should be attested to in other enlightenment traditions, not just in Buddhism or just in Theravada Buddhism. If you're okay with the idea that Theravada Buddhism has a total monopoly on enlightenment, that nobody who isn't a Theravada Buddhist can possibly become enlightened, then yeah, maybe that would be your explanation for why only Theravada Buddhism has this 4 stages of Ariyahood or 4 stages of sainthood or sagehood, and other traditions just don't have it because they just don't get that far. But I just don't buy it. It is true, I've mentioned this a number of times before, that St. John of the Cross, independently of Theravada Buddhism, I'm pretty sure, came up with the same 3 stages of development that is found in some suttas. Like in Pali, you've got the Putujana or the common worldling, you've got the Seka or the one in training, and you've got the Aseka or one who is no longer in training. And so that means, let's see, the Putujana is just the ordinary person. The Seka is someone who has had a glimpse of enlightenment. They're at least a Sotapanna, according to the Orthodox tradition, but they're still not fully enlightened yet. And the Aseka, or one who is no longer in training, is a fully enlightened being. And like I've said before, St. John of the Cross had a very similar 3 stages, where he had the beginner, which was, of course, most people, just like most people are Putujanas, 99.999% of the population. Then he had the adept, which would be someone who was a master of what in Theravada Buddhism would be called at least 2nd jhana, a master of what the Catholic contemplatives call contemplation, which is above meditation in Christianity. Meditation is where you are still like visualizing things or using mantras or something. You're still indulging in perception. Whereas when you get to the level of contemplation, you're not thinking anymore. So that would be at least 2nd jhana, because it's at 2nd jhana, according to Orthodox Theravadan tradition, that you stop thinking. And then finally, he's got the perfect, which is a person who has completely mortified their self-will. They no longer have any self-will, and they just act in accordance with the will of God. And of course, a Theravada Buddhist would have a different interpretation of that, but still, the Arahant has mortified his self-will, so to speak, because he's no longer making karma, and karma is will. So that 3 stages has more credibility for me, simply because 2 different spiritual traditions, highly advanced spiritual traditions, have come upon it independently of each other, apparently through empiricism, just through experience. Whereas these 4 stages, even various stages or various schools of Buddhism can't agree on what these 4 stages exactly mean. So that's the best argument I can give. And if you're not persuaded, you have more faith in the ancient tradition, which makes a lot of sense. I assume that most Theravada Buddhists would put more faith in established Theravadan tradition and what the texts say than in what I say. That makes perfect sense, and that's fine. But that's just my reasons, like the internal reason and the external reason. Then the one thing I was going to address towards the end is, could I do an individual video on this topic with Brian or Ajahn Punadhammo? Yeah, videos with Brian are they're kind of suspended indefinitely at present because he's in a bad way. Anyone who looks at his BitChute channel, looks at the videos he's been making for the past several days, will understand what I'm talking about. And because he is in a bad way, then I request that all friends of Brian Rue should send metta because I think he is in need of it. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana says, what are your thoughts on the original 8,000 line Prajnaparamita Sutra? It's not what the Buddha taught, but what about the teachings of the text on its own? I heard the Heart Sutra and Diamond Sutra are just snippets from it. Well, I have never read the entire 8,000 line Prajnaparamita Sutra. I mean, I've read excerpts from it. You know, like he's saying, the Heart Sutra are both Heart Sutras. I think there's like the greater Heart Sutra and the lesser Heart Sutra, and also the Diamond Sutra are like extracts from that. Although if that's the case, then it would seem that the 8,000 line Prajnaparamita Sutra may itself be like a compilation of different texts that then again sort of got redivided and turned into individual sutras, because like the Heart Sutra and the Diamond Cutter Sutra, I mean, they're just stand independently of each other. They really don't have anything to do with each other, other than that they're both supposedly teachings of the Buddha. So my understanding of Prajnaparamita Sutra, the original 8,000 line one, I don't have much of an opinion on it or many thoughts about it because I haven't read the whole thing. But the Heart Sutra and the Diamond Sutra, I mean, they are profound. They're more profound than most Pali suttas, in my opinion. So even though maybe the Buddha didn't teach them, he probably taught something similar to the main message of these Mahayana sutras. And really, that's what the Prajnaparamita, like the tradition of like the perfection of wisdom and the perfection of wisdom sutras, that it was like a reform movement. They're trying to get back to what the Buddha originally taught, instead of getting into all this Abhidhamma stuff, all this intellectual classification and systematization, which the older schools were really starting to wallow in. Like Theravada's got its Abhidhamma, it's got this elaborate commentarial system. It's got texts that are not considered to be Abhidhamma, but which are essentially the same kind of text as Abhidhamma, like the Patisambhida Magga and the Neti Pakarana, and there's one or two other ones that really they should be in Abhidhamma instead of in the suttas, but apparently they were too late. You know, it was like the Abhidhamma Pitaka was already finalized as 7 books or something, and so yeah, they just kind of added it. I think Neti Pakarana, it's considered to be canonical by the Burmese, but not necessarily by the Sri Lankans or the Thais. You know, there are certain texts that are like apocrypha or deuterocanonicals or something where not everybody agrees on whether it's canonical or not. Like I'm pretty sure that the Burmese consider the Milinda Panya, or the questions of King Milinda, to be canonical also. That's part of their Tipitaka, whereas I think the Sri Lankans do not consider the questions of King Milinda to be part of the Sutta Pitaka. So I do consider it to be profound. You know, getting back towards the spirit of like the Atthaka Wagga. So in a way, it was an attempt at getting back towards the original spirit of Dhamma or Dharma. But I mean, it has been, I mean, later ideas have still infiltrated, like the whole Bodhisattva idea. I mean, it's like an anachronism to have the Buddha talking about, you know, becoming, you know, bodhisattvas and so forth. So yeah, that's pretty much the extent of my thoughts on the 8,000 line Prajnaparamita Sutra. And I might as well say that I used to pronounce the word for wisdom in Sanskrit as prajna, which is the way it's spelled. And then I happened to be at an ayahuasca ceremony when I was still a monk, and there was this guy there dressed in these weird pajama clothes, and he came up and was talking to me, and I was telling him like my name, Panyobasa, and I was pronouncing it like the Sanskrit version of it as Prajna, and he was like shaken by this. It turned out he was like a teacher of Sanskrit or something, and the fact that a monk was pronouncing it that way instead of as Prajna, like Prajna. How would I just do it? Prajna. He was shaken by this. He just walked off by himself, like scratching his head, like wondering if he had been saying it wrong all this time. But I think I was the one who was saying it wrong. I think it's Prajna in Sanskrit, but who knows? It's spelled Prajna. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. Otherwise, I might be digressing wildly within another 3 to 5 minutes. So, Siovach and Sipa Zidana's next question is, in the Theravada Vinaya, it talks about the third council happening under Ashoka, but there is no evidence of this from the Ashokan edicts. The Sarvastivada Vinaya does not mention this event at all, and instead they claim the third council happened under the Kushan Emperor Kanishka. Based on how different their interpretations of events are, whether historical or not, I want to ask about the second council from the Theravada perspective, and maybe also some other schools. The Mahasangika made a schism by the 5 points of Mahadeva 37 years after there was a council for the Vinaya. This seems pretty suspicious to me that there was a Vinaya controversy that was mentioned, but that isn't what caused the schism. But instead, things like arahants being able to have wet dreams is what made most of the Sangha, since the name Mahasangika comes from most of the people siding with them in the Buddha's home region split. However, the Mahasangika Vinaya is around still and preserved in Chinese despite the lineage being dead now. Have you ever gotten your hands on this or heard what the Mahasangika said was the reason for the second council? Because I suspect they would not agree with it, and the Theravada story really doesn't add up, in my opinion. Well, getting up to the top here, the Theravada Vinaya does not talk about the third council at all, happening under Ashoka or otherwise. The Theravada Vinaya, the last 2 chapters of the Chulavagga are about the first council and the second council. So the history of the first and second councils are canonical. They are in the Tipitaka itself. Third council is not. So that's just in the commentarial tradition. There's no evidence of the third council happening under Ashoka. No evidence of it in the Ashokan edicts. Yeah, well, there's no evidence of a lot of things in the Ashokan edicts because he's just talking about certain specific things. It is attested that he sent out missionaries in various directions, and he did send missionaries to Sri Lanka and so forth. But I guess that's not really closely related to the third council anyhow. So the Sarvastivada Vinaya does not mention this event at all. Yeah, the Theravada Vinaya doesn't mention it either. And instead they claim the third council happened under the Kushan Emperor Kanishka. Yeah, that was going to be like the fourth council. From the Theravada point of view, the fourth council was going to be in the northwest, which was Sarvastivadin territory. It was a stronghold of the Sarvastivadins. Apparently, the Kushan Emperor Kanishka favored the Sarvastivadins. And so at this council, which was conducted, they came to the conclusion, not surprisingly, that the Sarvastivadin interpretation of Dhamma is the correct interpretation. So the other schools, or many other schools, including the Theravadin, simply rejected that council as invalid. And so the fourth council for Theravadins happened in Sri Lanka like 500 years after the time of the Buddha, and it's the one that, according to tradition, caused the Tipitaka to be written down, just so that it wouldn't be lost when monks who had memorized it died or whatever. Or just no new monks came along to memorize certain books. So, yeah, there has been sort of 2 different versions of what caused the first major schism. And the Theravadins say it was based mainly on Vinaya, and the Mahayanists, who kind of favored the other side, the Mahasangika side, were saying that it was about philosophical points. And it's really not possible to know with 100% certainty exactly what caused the first schism, other than, I mean, it's going to be just caused by isolation. Back in those days, news couldn't travel any faster than a monk could walk, really, with regard to Sangha affairs and so forth. And so it was sort of like the way Darwinian evolution occurs, where you have a population enters like an isolated area, like an island or something, then they're going to just, mainly due to just sort of random drift, be drifting in a different direction from the main population. And you're going to wind up with speciation, or in the case of Buddhist sects, like, what would you call it? Sectism, different sects, different schools. So, both sides of the debate, both sides of the Second Council do have recorded histories of the Second Council, and both sides agree that it was the Western monks, the Staviras or Proto-Terras, who won the debate. So, yeah, it could be that it was ultimately caused by something else, that the first schism didn't happen like Siovax here says, that it was a few decades after the second council that the schism actually happened. That apparently both sides agreed, the Western monks won the debate, that monks aren't allowed to handle money. That was according to Theravadan tradition, and this is backed up to some degree by other traditions. That was what caused the Second Council, was that the monks in the East, which was mainly the Buddha's own home territory, had started handling money. They'd also started breaking other rules, but money was the main thing that was being debated. And it was pretty clear that the Buddha did not allow monks to handle money. And so the Western monks won. And then apparently, this was it was less than 100 years after the time of the Buddha, because there was like a disciple of Ananda was one of the monks presiding on the Western, like the Stavira or Proto-Terra side of the debate. And if it was 100 years later, he'd be a really old monk. He'd be well over 100 years old, probably. So probably, I think it was Richard Gombrich has discussed this. And he was saying, it was maybe 70 years or so, 60, 70 years after the Parinibbana of the Buddha, then the Second Council came. And then it was like another, maybe 100 years after the death of the Buddha, or his Parinibbana, his exit from this world, that the split just became like a real schism. And it's hard to say, just because we have very scanty evidence one way or the other. So, you really can't be sure exactly how it happened, because there's just insufficient data, not enough evidence to really get anything close to certainty. Unless you're just a dogmatist, like if you're just accept whatever it says in the Pali texts or in the commentaries in this case, then you just go along with whatever your chosen religious system tells you, and then you just go along with that. A lot of people are like that. Probably most people, they just believe what they're told, whether it's by religious leaders or political leaders or propagandists or whatever. But it seems to me that we really can't be sure exactly what caused the first great schism in Buddhism. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Jeffrey. And Jeffrey said, "You seriously have great comedic timing and can keep a straight face. Have you thought of trying some open mic stand-up? Would participating in entertainment be against Buddhist rules?" Well, I've been told before that I ought to be a comedian or something, but I don't know. I don't think it's really my destiny to become a stand-up comic. So, yeah, there's many things I probably would have been good at. I'm not sure how good of a comedian I would be, but I don't think it's really the direction I'm going to be going in my later years. But then the second question here, would participating in entertainment be against Buddhist rules? It's not, it would be against probably Vinaya rules for a monk to do that. For a Buddhist layperson, there's just 5 precepts. Those are the Buddhist rules, are the 5 precepts for a layperson. And, there's no rule against participating in entertainment. Although, if you're taking 8 precepts, then, yeah, I assume it would be against the rules, since going to entertainment shows is forbidden by the 8 precepts. And if you're the one that's standing up on the stage entertaining people, that would pretty much include you also. But whether there's a rule against it or not, there are suttas saying that, like, actors and musicians and so forth are, I think actors especially, that they're going to go to hell. And I think that the Buddha probably wouldn't have really said that. I really doubt that all actors are going to go to hell. But again, it's a matter of whether you're going to just accept tradition just completely, or whether you're going to have a certain amount of Western, like modern Western skepticism, a certain amount of eclecticism also. So participating in entertainment would be against 8 precepts. Participating in entertainment shows. But with regard to 5 precepts, I'm not sure. And, it's like some Dhamma teachers will tell jokes. I crack some jokes occasionally, like Ram Dass would tell jokes and have people laughing in his audience. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. So I am sure that you could come up with like a Buddhist stand-up comedy routine that would be to some degree even uplifting, like the Buddhist coroner who got fired from his job for putting birth as cause of death for every person that he did autopsies on, cause of death, birth. But I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Gamma Spectrologist. And Gamma Spectrologist says, regarding good and bad karma, are you just using this good versus bad terminology as kind of a loose way of pointing to what might be more accurately described as uncomfortable and comfortable karma? I see good and bad just descriptors that reflect more of the perceiver's chosen experience than the experience itself. I've tried to remove these dualistic descriptors from my assessment of experiences. And in Buddhist philosophy, good and bad usually they're not used much. That really, with regard to karma especially, the main dichotomy, the 2 kinds of karma are kusala and akusala. That kusala can be called good karma and akusala can be called bad karma, but literally means skillful karma and unskillful karma, skillful action and unskillful action. So skillful is what gets you closer to enlightenment. Unskillful is what takes you farther away from enlightenment. But just as a convenient way of talking, sometimes you just use good and bad. Like you're giving up, you got a Seattle, some monk giving a sermon to a group of villagers with grade school educations who are subsistence farmers, then he'll be using good and bad more than you're going to find in a Buddhist philosophical text, because that's the way people think. Or in Burma, kudo, which is the Burmese version of the word kusala, kusala kama they call kudo. That's merit. They want kudo. So it's just kind of turned. They don't really know that it means skillful. They just think it means that's good. That's what you want. You want kudo. But it's just like a loose way of talking, really. Some things good is just, what gets you closer to enlightenment, and bad is what gets you farther away from enlightenment. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from RPAD. And RPAD says, as it seems mankind is birthing AI and turning itself into machines, should we expect to be reborn as such? And I don't think so, because even, just assume for the sake of argument, that you can program consciousness into a computer, or you've got a computer that's so complex and like recursive in its programming that it can program itself, and it eventually just hits this what would you call it, inflection point or something, where it just becomes conscious. Let's just assume that. Even so, I am sure that the consciousness of a computer would be radically different from the consciousness of a human, like, or the mentality of a computer, let's say, would be radically different from the mentality of a human. That it would just be like a quantum leap, especially if you consider that with this recursive self-improvement of computers, they're going to be as far beyond us as we are beyond an amoeba within a relatively short time, assuming that it happens, assuming that the technological singularity actually happens. Then yeah, I mean, they're going to hit the belt, they're going to hit the curve, and then, you know, we're going to be down here and they're going to be way up there, and they're going to be trillions of times or billions of times more intelligent than us. And I don't think that our karma would fit into this new kind of mentality that has come into existence. So we'd be reborn maybe in some alternate world where the AI hasn't happened yet or something. Some other kind of being that's closer to a human. You know, because we are human, we've got human mentality, that our karma, you know, assuming rebirth is real, that we're going to be reborn as something kind of similar to a human with kind of similar mentality to a human, because that's the momentum of our mind. You know, it's the momentum of our mental states is passed on to the next life. And yeah, I think it wouldn't be similar enough to some sort of conscious AI and anywhere near to it. That, I mean, we're going to have to find some other way of being reborn, you know, in a more human-like existence, if this world just gets taken over by computers or something, by robots. So yeah, there is going to be sort of a weird transitional kind of karma where in the future people are going to have like their brains augmented so that their IQ is going to be boosted by 100 points or something. And I mean, that's going to take strange karma too. And so you're going to have just people with strange karma are going to be born, you know, with that kind of karma are going to be born in this world more. And the normie kind of person is going to be born in this world less. You know, they're going to have to be born somewhere else, presumably. And this is a infinitely large universe, regardless of what some astronomers might tell you. Just whatever can happen does happen. You know, it's just infinite possibilities. So if this world stops being suitable habitation for us humans, we're going to have to be reborn on some sufficiently similar world in the many worlds, according to the many worlds hypothesis. So let's see here. I guess I answered that question. I hope I did. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Lieberlam. And I have to admonish Lieberlam that he asked 4 questions here. Although he didn't ask them all at the same time and he may have lost count. 4 is getting up into kind of high numbers. So we got to take that into consideration. I mean, 4 is up into like the realm of several. So Lieberlam's first question is, what are the main distinctions you would make between the teachings of the Buddha and the philosophy of Adi Shankara? And I assume he's talking about Shankaracharya, who was like one of the founding fathers of Advaita Vedanta. And the teachings of the Buddha versus the teachings of Shankara. If I were talking about the teachings of the Buddha, then I'd have to go back to something sort of like what the Atthakavagga teaches. So Buddha and Shankara were mystics, that they were non-dualistic, I'm pretty sure. It's just that Shankara was more heavily influenced by the Vedic tradition, like the Upanishads, and was more philosophical, sort of like Buddhists became after the time of the Buddha. They became very philosophical too. And in fact, Shankara apparently was heavily influenced by Mahayana Buddhism, especially like the Madhyamaka school of Mahayana Buddhism. So there's a lot of similarity. It's just that Advaita Vedanta is, it's part of the Vedic tradition. So it considers the Vedas to be authoritative and is heavily based on the philosophy of the Upanishads. Whereas the Buddha, he tried to just almost get rid of philosophy. If you read the Atthakavagga, it's just no perception, no view, no belief, that even your thoughts are extraneous to you. It's like that's not you. And it never says what you are, because there really is no you. But it's just like pure mysticism, where you're just sort of leaving behind all this intellectual derbis, all this rubbish, and just experiencing just the phenomenon of consciousness directly as consciousness, without thinking that way, because then you're thinking again. So you just do it. You just stop thinking, or think as little as you can, at least not wallow in it. Stop identifying with it. Stop identifying with your thoughts and your beliefs and so forth. Say nothing of your body. And so, there's a lot of similarity. It's just that Shankara's Advaita Vedanta is way more Hinduistic. It's more Vedic. It's more Upanishadic. So it's going to reify the absolute as Brahman, let's say, or Nirguna Brahman, which is like ultimate reality, which has no discernible qualities. But even that's just too much thinking for the person who was teaching the Atthakavagga. At the surface level, the level of just samsara, where you got to move around and eat and wear clothes and stuff, you can talk about that, but you don't kid yourself that is reality. That's just perception. And I've noticed I'm waving my hands around in this video a lot. So, yeah, I'm no authority on Shankara. I have read a considerable amount of what he was doing. He was apparently a Shaivite. There's a lot of stuff where he's referring to Lord Shiva and so forth. That, that obviously has nothing to do with Buddhism. So, I guess maybe I answered that question about as well as I can, because, I know something about early Buddhism, but my knowledge of Shankaracharya is rather limited. I have read some of the stuff that he wrote, and I am vaguely, maybe a little more than vaguely familiar with Advaita Vedanta. And they really are pretty close. If I wasn't a Buddhist, there's a good chance I'd be a Vedantist Hindu, because they are very close. It's just the main difference is just a matter of language, like semantics or something. Are you going to reify the absolute, or are you going to not reify the absolute? Is there going to be an Atman, which is just this universal Atman that all beings share? Or is there just going to be no Atman? And really, it's just a matter of perception, which way you're going to choose. It's almost like an arbitrary choice. Either side will have its pros and cons, but ultimately, like the Atthakavagga, you get rid of self and not self. Any beliefs about self, get rid of them. Any beliefs about not self, get rid of them. But that's really advanced practice. Only someone who's really advanced is going to be able to do that. So I guess I'll just move on to Lieberlam's next question, which is as follows. I've heard there is meditation on the loathsomeness of food, ahare patikula sanya. If you practice this as a monk, do you feel that you had a knack for this sort of contemplation more than others who can't help but consider food like a treasure? I've practiced it a little bit, but it's a total buzzkill. It's like one of the few pleasures still allowed to a bhikkhu, according to the text, is eating. And if you practice the meditation on the loathsomeness of food, especially while you're eating, then, I mean, it just kind of makes it disgusting, which is what it's supposed to do. And it's kind of tough to do that. You know, it's like when you're only allowed just a very limited number of pleasures in life, and you're encouraged to kind of ruin those pleasures. There's a certain reluctance, and it's just kind of, there's a certain reluctance to just dwell on something that's disgusting and repulsive anyway. So, I mean, I could do it. Even having a degree in biology maybe helped me do it a little better. But I mean, it's the practice of the meditation on the perception of the loathsomeness of food or the repulsiveness of food. Mainly what you do is you just try to visualize what's happening to that food as it's going through your body. You put it into your mouth, and already you're chewing it up into this goo, and it's getting all mixed with slobber. And then you swallow it, and it goes down into this skin sack, essentially, full of puke and acid and so forth. And then it gets farther down and turns into even more disgusting stuff. So just imagining, what is going on with the food you're eating while you're eating it. That's like the main time you practice on the meditation on the loathsomeness of food is while you're eating. And it just destroys your enjoyment of the food. So let's see here. What was the main question here? Do you feel that you had a knack for this sort of contemplation more than others who can't help but consider food like a treasure? Yeah, I mean, some people would just say, no way, I'm not going to do that. That's gross. But I mean, I experimented with it. But really, it does just kind of destroy your meal in a way. Which, if you're really just a hardcore ascetic, that's fine. That's what you're supposed to do. You should just destroy any pleasure that you might be tempted to wallow in. And food is a major one. A lot of monks, they can be very ascetic in certain ways, but they still like their food. I knew this one Japanese monk who one of his main reasons for staying at Pa'ak Doya was he really liked the noodles there. He was a good monk too, in other respects. So, yeah, I guess I answered that question. And the next question, these are all kind of linked together, so it might kind of give Lieberlam an excuse for asking more than the allowable number of questions, just because they're all the second, third, and fourth questions after his Adi Shankara question are all related here. He says, is it difficult with the dietary practices of a monk to cultivate this sort of contemplative disgust? With the dietary practices of a monk, no, it makes it easier, because first of all, if a monk goes for alms, he's got many people. I've had more than 100 people put food into this bowl, and it's a relatively large bowl. It's back there on the table, holds more than a gallon. So you got all this stuff that's just kind of combined together into this glop. And then for a few years, I also had the practice of, before I would even eat, I would just stir it all together into really just goo, just this nondescript goo. It can make it taste a little better, the flavors blend better and so forth, but still, what you're eating looks fairly disgusting already. And just being a monk also, it helps you to be contemplative of this sort of thing, just because you're encouraged to contemplate this sort of thing again and again in the suttas, according to the tradition that you have adopted. It's not like being a foodie and watching the Food Network and so forth. Although, speaking of which, watching the Food Network, I just have to say that I think possibly the best job in the world would be to be a judge on a show like Chopped, where they're eating gourmet food and then just criticizing it. It's that's your job. You sit there, you eat gourmet food, and then you say, the crust is a little soggy. Maybe it could have had a little more salt. That kind of thing. But I digress again quite thoroughly. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next part of this series of food questions. Let's call it a sub-question to get Lieberlam off the hook for asking too many questions. says, what are your thoughts on disgust? Well, this is more of a disgust question, I guess. What are your thoughts on disgust as something conducive to Dhamma practice? I've heard right-wing folks are more likely to have stronger disgust reaction than libs. Well, I've never heard that before, that right-wingers or conservatives or traditionalists are more likely to feel disgust than libs. Maybe in this world we live in now, but it seems like left-leaning people, yeah, I guess they're not so much disgusted as offended, which is different. That's a different thing. So maybe he's right. I don't know about that one. But what are your thoughts on disgust as something conducive to Dhamma practice? Well, I mean, there is like the 3 stages of enlightenment, different from the 3 stages I've already mentioned, but I have mentioned it before in these Q&As. It's Nibbana leads to viraga, which leads to vimokkha. And Nibbana is essentially disgust, or just being fed up. You know, that is like the first step towards enlightenment in this 3 stages, or these 3 steps. You know, it's like you turn away from samsara. You don't want to wallow in it anymore. That leads to viraga, or dispassion, where it's just sort of like equanimity. You know, first you don't want to wallow in it anymore. You sort of detach from it originally because you're disgusted by it, or you're just fed up with it, and then that causes a certain peace or dispassion, like equanimity, and then that is like the stage before vimokkha, or liberation, or enlightenment. So definitely disgust is conducive to Dhamma practice. In fact, the Visuddhimagga, for what it's worth, is talking about the 6 main personality types of humans, the 6 main characters, which are essentially based on lobha, dosa, moha, greed, hate, delusion, and their opposites. And he does, Buddhaghosa, the author of the book, does point out that people who have a lot of dosa, or aversion, can get enlightened more easily than other people, because they're more likely to just get fed up and disgusted and just detach themselves from the world. They disapprove of the world. They're less likely to wallow in it. Still, having aversion is you're making karma, but at least you're making karma by pushing yourself away from all this stuff that most people want to wallow in. So, I mean, it's ultimately disgust is a kind of dosa, or aversion, which is one of the 3 poisons and all that. But it's kind of a skillful means that can get you farther along in Dhamma, and then you let go of it. I mean, eventually you have to let go of it. So a fully enlightened being isn't disgusted anymore by anything. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Mooners. And Mooners says, does Buddhism promote antinatalism? And antinatalism, for those of you unfamiliar with large words like this with lots of syllables, means like discouraging having children. You know, it's against having babies. And Buddhist philosophy, in a way, it does promote antinatalism. Certainly monks and nuns aren't allowed to do the act that makes babies. And if you don't know what that is, ask your dad. He'll explain it to you. But, I mean, with regard to lay people, it's just accepted as just the way it is. You're making a certain amount of unskillful karma by wallowing in lust and sensuality and so forth, but it's just the way of the world, and it's just not realistic to tell people not to have babies. If they're lay people, they can do as they want. You know, they haven't taken any monastic vows or anything. So, get married, raise a family. I mean, that's just what most people have done since people have been on this planet. And I mean, you pretty much have to have babies if the human race isn't going to become extinct. And of course, you can't have monks and nuns living on their own without being supported by good families with little kids and so forth, because monks and nuns aren't allowed to feed themselves. You know, they have to rely upon lay people for support. So it's slightly ambivalent, the attitude towards having babies. I mean, ultimately, an enlightened being isn't going to want to have sex no more, at least according to Theravadan tradition. And from this, from the higher ethics of like monastic Buddhism, having kids and so forth, it gets you so entangled in samsara that, I mean, it's much more difficult to become enlightened if you've got kids, because you've got so many worries, so many concerns, so many obligations and duties and so forth. You got to work for a living to support your kids, make sure that they grow up like good people and so forth. And I mean, it's like I had a friend of mine who, when he had a kid, he was telling me that when you're a parent with a toddler, every time that toddler even starts walking towards a street, I mean, he could be 50 feet back, but still there's this visceral dread of him just like plunging right in front of traffic or something. And it's just the way it is. It's more of a roller coaster ride. I'm sure that young parents, especially when they're all doped up on parenthood hormones, there's a lot of euphoria, a lot of love and bliss and joy and so forth. But there's a lot of up and down. I mean, little kids, like, they have no concept of hygiene. They're continually like falling for no good reason and hitting their head on the corner of the coffee table or some such, having to be rushed to the doctor. Try to say hospital and doctor at the same time. So, yeah, from an advanced spiritual point of view, you're better off not having kids, but most people aren't spiritually all that much advanced, and it's just the way of the world. It's just completely natural. And so, I mean, the Buddha himself had a kid, according to tradition, before he renounced the world. Obviously, his parents had a kid. I mean, it's just the way it is. It's just one of those things in life. Buddhism is different from other religious systems like Christianity in that just being alive entails a certain amount of, it's almost mandatory bad karma or akusala karma. That, I mean, you have to be like a radical ascetic saint in order to live a clean life and not be doing anything bad or akusala, unskillful. And just, from the point of view of Buddhism, even for a married couple, they've been married for 30 years. They love each other dearly. They're completely faithful to each other. Even then, when they have sex, they're wallowing in sensuality and lust and so forth. And so they're making a certain amount of unskillful karma. And having babies is the same kind of deal. It's just one of those things about just being a human that, it's just part of the package, so to speak. So at the higher levels, yeah, it promotes antinatalism indirectly through just promoting celibacy and so forth. But at the lower levels, it really doesn't. I mean, the Buddha didn't badmouth people for having kids because it's just the way people are. It's of necessity the way people are. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Rui. And Rui says, it is said in all traditions, I think, that when the teachings are gone, another Buddha will appear to teach. This could point to some sort of ruling, overarching universal agency or principle. Then he's got karma question mark in parentheses. Or do the teachings and the teacher reappear organically from their own absence? Well, it's interesting what he says about some sort of ruling or overarching universal agency or principle, because if you read the more devotional stuff, like the Buddha Wamsa, which is in the Pali Tipitaka, it's one of the books of the Pali Tipitaka, in the Sutta Pitaka, that all Buddhas, forever and ever, in the past and into the future, they follow this same template. They have to renounce the world, and when they renounce the world, they've got like their attendant with them, and there's a certain limited number of vehicles that they can take, and they go out and have to practice austerities, and then they're going to become enlightened sitting under a certain tree, and there's always going to be someone who offers them the milk rice on the eve of their enlightenment, and they're always going to have two chief disciples. And it never explains why this has to be, why there couldn't be a Buddha with only one chief disciple or three chief disciples, or why he couldn't become enlightened sitting out under the open sky or in a hut or something, in a cave maybe. I mean, that's just the way it is. And it's like mythology, essentially. Or maybe that's just the way it has to be, due to some ruling or overarching universal agency or principle. But for me, I'm just naturally skeptical of that sort of thing. So, when the teachings are gone, another Buddha will appear to teach. I mean, you could say that that's part of the same sort of thing I've been talking about, or you could just say that it's inevitable that on this world, among human beings, when enlightened systems die out, it's just inevitable that somebody's going to come along to rediscover, the possibility of enlightenment and how to become enlightened, assuming that there is a how. So, I mean, you could argue it either way, I think. You could say that the teachings and the teacher reappear organically, just because it's just a matter of inevitability, just like statistical probability that sooner or later you're going to have another spiritual genius come along who rediscovers Dhamma. And so that part I think can just be natural and just inevitable. But the whole part about, you have to practice the austerities first, you have to leave in a certain kind of vehicle with an attendant, and you have to become enlightened sitting under some kind of large plant, and you got to have two chief disciples and so forth. Yeah, I think that's just made up. That's tradition that it gives people something to cling to, I guess. And it's a little more skillful thing to cling to than favorite football team or favorite soap opera or something. So I'm not exactly sure how to proceed with this question. And so I'm just going to move on to Rui's next question, which is as follows. I interpret samaditi, which is right view, and the same of the other samas in the Eightfold Path as complete view, literally as a 360-degree view which lacks nothing, in which there are no blind spots anymore. Paradoxically, the complete view could be or lead to not having views at all, but perhaps not the other way around, thus opening up the door or paving the way to cessation. Thoughts? Well, if you consider that samaditi, or right view, is the very first step, I don't think that essentially omniscience would be really a good first step towards enlightenment. A 360-degree view which lacks nothing, in which there are no blind spots anymore. I mean, it seems like that would sort of arguably be omniscience. And I'm not sure that even the Buddha himself, according to tradition, had a 360-degree view. I mean, an enlightened Jain leader like Mahavira supposedly was, he saw everything from every angle, just instantaneously. He'd look at a roll of toilet paper, for example, and he'd see it from every single possible angle. He'd see every single aspect of that simultaneously. But it's really not even an option in Theravada Buddhism. The Buddha, he was functionally omniscient in that he would know whatever he wanted to know. But if he didn't particularly want to know it, he wouldn't just have his mind filled with infinite knowledge at all times. So, nevertheless, samma, which is usually translated as right, samaditi, right view, it can mean something like complete, or for example, samma sambuddha. I usually translate that as rightly fully enlightened one, or I think I've also possibly translated as completely fully enlightened one. Samma can mean complete, but it would have to be complete with regard to just the requisites of what you need to move forwards. I don't think it would have to be just a comprehensive view which lacks nothing and which there are no blind spots. I mean, it would have to be comprehensive enough, I guess. You have to know what you need to know in order to have the remaining 7 right steps on the path. So, let's see. Hope I'm answering this. I mean, this is one of those ones where somebody will give their own philosophical view and then just say thoughts at the end. And I'm not bashing that in any way. Unless, of course, it's getting into like a really long essay. That happens sometimes too. But this is not a really long essay. This is just a short paragraph here. So, yeah. And then if you expand that, like somehow right view, and then it'd be like right mental action, or which would be complete mental action, complete verbal action, complete bodily action, complete livelihood. I mean, a comprehensive livelihood. Yeah, I don't think it really fits the context very well. At least not with regard to just comprehensive 360 degrees. I don't think it really would fit the context of the philosophical concepts. But who knows? I mean, if it works, go with it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Don. And Don says, I've heard it said by you, I think, and Yuta Dhammo Bhikkhu, that those who feel a lot of pain or suffer a lot in this life were cruel to others in past lives. Where in the suttas is this written? And I didn't search out. There's like 1 or 2 main suttas where it's just like this cookbook thing where if you do this in a previous life, you're going to have this result in the following life. Like I do remember like, if you're ugly in this life, it meant that you were an angry person in the previous life, that sort of thing. So it could be from there. I think there's a good chance that sutta, and I don't even remember what sutta it is. It's a relatively famous one. That it may be that sutta which talks about it. Although it is just kind of common sense that, you know, if there is such a thing as karma and you're getting, you know, a lot of pain or something in this life, that you must have done something really unskillful in a past life or earlier in the same life that is conditioning that you cause some sort of imbalance in the ethical equilibrium of the world or of your own personal world that, I mean, it's having to come back the other way and cause pain onto you. But it's not necessarily, I mean, if you suffer a lot in this life, it seems to me you weren't necessarily cruel to others in past lives. And I got like a hair or something on my nose that's making it itch. Excuse me. But I mean, it's like some people, you know, they just wallow in a lot of pleasure, which causes like pain afterwards. Like they eat way too much and then they wind up with health problems because of their overeating, or they have a lot of sex and then they wind up with, you know, some kind of bad STD or something that causes them great suffering. So it's not necessarily a case that if you suffer a lot in this life, it's because you were cruel to others. That's one possibility. You know, that's one possible reason, but I don't think it's the only possible reason. It's just, it's going to depend on your own like personal subconscious idiosyncrasies, how your karma is going to manifest itself. I think it's not going to be exactly the same for everybody, although because we're all members of the same species, so to speak, we're all going to be more alike than different. So there are going to be certain main things that can cause suffering through the karma that we make. And I do think that cruelty to others can cause suffering in this life. For what it's worth, what was his name? The sleeping prophet, Edgar Cayce. When he would go into his trance and diagnose people with some sort of bad ailment, some painful ailment, he would say, you know, in some cases, well, you lived in ancient Rome. A lot of Americans apparently were Romans in a previous life. And you go to the Colosseum and watch people get tortured to death or eaten by lions, and you were like laughing and cheering, and that was the karma that caused this. So, I mean, it's possible. I mean, I'm not insinuating that Edgar Cayce was like, he was an infallible prophet or anything. I mean, some of his prophecies have apparently have not come true. Like he was saying that there would be proof of Atlantis found in a pyramid by the end of the 20th century, and they're keeping it secret because they're not telling us about it. So, yeah, I don't think I was the one who said it. Maybe Yuta Dhammo Bhikkhu did, but or maybe I just said it in a moment of philosophical carelessness, because really, I mean, it can be that just excess of pleasure can cause an excess of its opposite. You wallow in too much pleasure, it's gonna come around and bite you in the ass. It can work that way too. And I probably just made a sound on the microphone by hitting it with my thumb. Okay, so I'm gonna make sure that my computer's muted. Okay, we're good. Aren't you just glad that I don't do anything to make my videos seem better? Don't do any editing, any of that silliness. Okay, I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is also from Don. I think I answered the last one, yeah. So he says, regarding matter appearing and disappearing a zillion times a second, according to Theravada, this is from New Scientist magazine. And then it says, quote, matter is built on flaky foundations. Physicists have now confirmed that the apparently substantial stuff is actually no more than fluctuations in the quantum vacuum. The researchers simulated the frantic activity that goes on inside protons and neutrons. These particles provide almost all the mass of ordinary matter. Each proton or neutron is made of 3 quarks, but the individual masses of these quarks only add up to about 1% of the proton's mass. So what accounts for the rest of it? Theory says it is created by the force that binds quarks together, called the strong nuclear force. In quantum terms, the strong force is carried by a field of virtual particles called gluons, randomly popping into existence and disappearing again, unquote. And then Don says, maybe Theravada had it right all along? What are your thoughts? Well, I'm just not a materialist. I do not think that matter is ultimately real. So these physicists, as their science improves, as their understanding of samsara improves, they're getting more and more ephemeral. It's becoming less and less physical. But I mean, they're probably going to continue in that direction until finally the universe will be identified as just a manifestation of mind. So yeah, I don't really think that, I mean, you can say, I mean, the Theravadins had it right to the extent that everything is in constant change from a samsaric perspective. Everything has to be in a state of continuous change because that's how our mind works. I mean, if your mind stays the same for 2 moments in a row, you're not going to be aware of those 2 moments. You're going to just be aware of one moment because your mind can't be aware because it's not doing anything. It's just like frozen. So you have to have constant change. In a way, it's like a good example of dependent co-arising is like chaos and stasis have to be in this delicate, harmonious balance. You have too much chaos, that's death. You have too much stasis, that's also death. So life is sort of like this balancing act between chaos and stasis, or just change and non-change. Something has to stay pretty much the same while something else changes in order for us to progress from one moment to the next without just annihilating or something. So I don't know if that was anywhere close to answering this question, though. But I do think that science, they're groping towards, they're groping gradually away from physicality. And so as they make more and more progress, the universe, the empirical universe, is going to become less and less material, less and less physical. So they're still on the way. They haven't quite got there yet, in my opinion. And so I'm going to move on to the next question. And it's bugging me because I seem to remember that one of the very first questions asked was with regard to the first sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, and I'm not seeing it, which is kind of bugging me. I thought maybe Siovak and Sipat Zidana or somebody like that asked this question about maybe the Mula Pariyaya Sutta. In fact, there were two questions about that same sutta in this Q&A, and I thought one was towards the top and one was towards the bottom, and I'm not really particularly close to the top anymore, and I haven't gotten to it yet, which is causing me to feel a certain insecurity, if you will. But anyways, the next question is from Indian guy, who also goes by the alias of Trevor under certain circumstances. And he says at the end of the, here it is. Here it is. He says, at the end of the root of all things, that's the first sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, the Mula Pariyaya Sutta. It says that the bhikkhus did not delight in the Buddha's words. What have you heard about this, and why did they not like it? Probably because they didn't understand at first, I'm guessing. Well, the first sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, I mean, it's considered to be profound, like in Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation of it, or his co-translation with Bhikkhu Nyanamoli, the first famous Nyanamoli, not the recent famous Nyanamoli. He's saying that it's so profound that you should, when you first read it, you should just kind of, skim over it, read it, but not try to really figure it out, and then come back to it later and do like a systematic study, because it's such a profound sutta. And the very fact that it's number one, the very first sutta in the collection, indicates that it was considered by ancient monks to be important enough that it should be first in line. And at the end, like Indian guy says here, the monks did not delight in the Buddha's words. And all you got to do is you just get the book, the Majjhima Nikaya, and all the end notes are by Bhikkhu Bodhi. And then you just go to the end here, and it says here, the bhikkhus did not delight in the Buddha's words, apparently because the discourse probed too deeply into the tender regions of their own conceit, and perhaps their residual Brahmanic views. At a later time, the Majjhima Nikaya commentary tells us, when their pride had been humbled, the Buddha expounded to these same bhikkhus the Gautamaka Sutta, which is Anguttara Nikaya 3:123, in the course of which they all attained arahantship. So the sutta is sort of digging into sort of the nature of unenlightenment. And because all these monks, apparently, that the Buddha was giving the sermon to were unenlightened, it made them feel uncomfortable, because it's sort of getting into all the inner workings of their mind. And when you're unenlightened, you're unenlightened because you want to be unenlightened, essentially. It's like you're trying to remain unenlightened because you're identifying with your concept of self and so forth. You're identifying with your thoughts and your beliefs and all that. And he was sort of taking pokes at that. And that's why the monks felt uncomfortable and they were not delighting. And some texts or some teachings of Buddhism really can have that effect. Like, for example, the Diamond Cutter Sutra that has already been mentioned in this Q&A, there are a few mentions of the idea that, or at least one mention, that if you can read this text or hear it recited and not feel alarm and dread, that means you're a bodhisattva. So that's, according to the Diamond Cutter Sutra, I'm a bodhisattva, because I really do appreciate that text. But a lot of people, when they read that stuff, they feel alarm and dread. Even just the whole concept of no self, or anatta, not self, no self, whatever you want to call it, that causes some people to feel a certain amount of discomfort and lack of delight. Or even just the disgustingness of food. Just do that meditation for a while, and you're not going to delight in it. Who's going to delight in disgust? I mean, I guess you can have a certain perverse enjoyment of disgust. I mean, I have to admit, disgust is a feeling that I'm kind of a disgust snob in a way. that is, I've refined it. I can have a certain appreciation of like refined disgust. But again, I'm digressing. So let's see. Yeah, I think I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to Indian guy's next question here. If a monk following Vinaya can't relieve himself in water or live grass and plants, then where is the best, easiest way to go without possible harm to life? To dig a hole in just dirt? Poop on the street? Nope. Or could it be something like a second alms round where you ask to be given refuge in lay people's latrine? Toilets ultimately have water and creeping things in the sewers. It just seems like to me that you're holding in a lot of 1 and 2. So, all right, this whole thing is referring to some Sakya rules that are in the Patimokkha, and it's saying a monk should not relieve himself into water or onto green plants. He's not supposed to spit into water or onto green plants either. But it's a Sakya rule, which means that it's against the rules only if you do it out of disrespect for the rule. It's like, it's against the rules and you just don't give a shit, so to speak. And so you do whatever it is you're going to do. I'm not going to say the word shit again because that's uncivilized. So, yeah, I mean, if you have no choice, then it's not against the rules. I mean, if you just gotta go and you're standing in a prairie, just grass as far as the eye can see, then you're not going to break a rule by peeing on the ground there. But I mean, under ordinary circumstances, there's always some place where you can relieve yourself. There's flat rocks, there's just bare dirt, there's sand, there's gravel, and also there's latrine pits at monasteries, and also just urinals at monasteries, so that you can go to the bathroom without having to go to the bathroom into water. I mean, it's not like toilets here. And some strict monks, when they come to America, they really don't know what to do because they're not supposed to go to the bathroom into the water, but the toilet bowl is full of water. And you're not supposed to throw your butt wiping stick into the toilet either. So some Asian monks just don't know any better, I guess. They wipe their behind and then throw the shitty toilet paper into the garbage can. But I guess I'm digressing again. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, there's no problem. I was a monk for many years. I followed Vinaya relatively strictly up until the very end. And, yeah, I mean, it just wasn't a problem. You can live out in the woods and just crap on the ground. It's not like it's just a constant coat of green everywhere. So, I mean, there's going to be gravel and sand and bare dirt and big flat rocks and all sorts of things. And nice villagers will come and volunteer to dig you a latrine, which is what happened to me. So, let's see here. Yeah, without possible harm to life. Also, in the commentaries, I'm pretty sure, when it says you're not supposed to pee or poop into water, that means water that may contain living beings. And the living beings have to be visible. We're not talking about microbes. We're not talking about any microbial biome. We're talking about, little insects and so forth that you can actually see with your eyes. So, I guess I answered that question. Although it does seem, if you read Vinaya, that there was like a different place to urinate than for taking a dump. that in ancient monasteries, they had latrines that had it set up differently for urinating and taking a dump. So maybe it had something to do with this rule or these rules. But it's not really important, because very few of us are monks or following these rules. And so I'm just going to, and they're not really important rules anyway. They're Sakya rules, which means you're only breaking the rule if you do it out of disrespect for the rule. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Pranav. And Pranav says, is premature pregnancies a sign of human lifespan declining? I don't think so. I mean, according to the theory that you can find in the texts, human life is going to get shorter and shorter and shorter. We're on the decline until the lifespan's only going to be it's like 7 or 10 years, something like that. And so, I mean, you're going to have kids like when you're like 5 or something. And premature pregnancy. I'm sure that premature pregnancies happened more in ancient times than they do now. I mean, cultures nowadays, women are like full grown as a general rule in most cultures, especially in the West, before they get married or start having kids. Whereas in like older traditional cultures, a girl was of marriageable age pretty much as soon as she hit puberty, maybe even before then. So premature pregnancies in that case. Oh, wait, maybe he's talking not premature pregnancies in the sense of like a 13-year-old girl getting pregnant. Maybe he's talking about premature births, like the baby's getting born prematurely, like after only 8 months or something. So I'm not exactly sure what the question means now. I've just confused myself. But I do not think that even though there is a sutta, at least one sutta saying that, we should be on the decline and lifespans are going to get shorter and shorter with less and less Dhamma in the world. Lifespans have increased dramatically since the Buddhist time, which kind of belies the prophecy. So I really am reluctant to attribute that prophecy to the Buddha himself. I've got something in my throat kind of all of a sudden. So premature pregnancy is a sign of human lifespan decline. I don't think so. I think that's what I should have said right towards the beginning, but I've always got to have an answer 50 times as long as the question. So I'm just going to move on to Pranav's next question here. I once tried to do metta meditation, but didn't get the feeling, just felt like repeating a mantra. How to get that feeling? And I can sympathize with that because I've never had much use for metta meditation because you can't really force yourself to feel loving kindness for all beings. I mean, in a way, you can start by sending metta to someone who's easy to send metta to, like a cute dog or something, or just a friend, maybe one of your parents, something like that. And then after you get good at that, maybe you can start expanding to some people that you don't like or just people in general or whatever. But yeah, I've never really had much use for metta meditation because in a way it's hypocritical. I mean, I've already told the story probably at least 2 or 3 times about one of my supporters in Burma who, I mean, she was always having to have she was one of those people that had to be at war with somebody. She had to have an enemy, some kind of feud going on in order for her to feel fully alive, apparently. And she had this feud going on with this guy who lived down the street because he had renovated a pagoda that was on her family's property. And then he put his family's name on this pagoda because he renovated, he painted it, put gold leaf and stuff on it. And so they were having this war back and forth over this. And one time she was bragging to me about how she does metta meditation every morning. She sends metta to all beings every morning. And I said, well, if you're sending metta to all beings, you're also sending it to that guy down the street that you're at war with. And all of a sudden it was like her whole demeanor changed. And she was like, no, not him. And that's the way a lot of people do metta meditation. It's sort of like they're imagining that they're sending love to all beings. They're getting like this warm, glowy feeling, but it doesn't get much farther than that. And so, yeah, I mean, if you just don't feel it, I wouldn't even do it unless you can work out some way. Like I already mentioned, you start off with somebody that you can feel genuine metta for, preferably not a mate. They advise you in the text not to choose like a sex object for sending metta because it can just inflame you. But, like a brother, sister, your parent, just a good friend, your dog, something like that. You start off with that and then maybe you can progress and send it, more universally after you've gotten good at it with regard to, the bunny slope of somebody that you already like. But yeah, I was never really much into meditation, just for the same reason, that it's not even really a feeling. Because sometimes you get the warm, glowy feeling. That's all it is. It's just a warm, glowy feeling. It's not really sending love to all beings. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Mara Made Mahayana. And Mara Made Mahayana says, the Buddha taught right view. Shouldn't the Buddhists, when asked about other religions, proclaim Buddhism as the only true path to Nibbana, instead of claiming, as some leading Buddhists in the world do, that all religions are the same? Well, I think this is a false dichotomy, because those aren't the only two options. So let's see here. I do not think that Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism is necessarily the only true path to Nibbana, but I also don't think that all religions are the same. Some religions, enlightenment is not an option. It's not even on the map. Like a Jehovah's Witness, they got no clue with regard to enlightenment. The best they can hope for is to be one of the 144,000 who go up into heaven after the rapture and get administrative jobs for the kingdom of heaven. And then the rest of the people, the highest they can hope for is to just spend forever and ever picking fruits and vegetables, going on picnics, and hugging wild animals. If you read their literature, this, or even like Quranic Islam really doesn't have anything higher to offer than going up into this paradise-like heaven with, the dark-eyed houris and all that, and the streams flowing with, well, maybe it wouldn't be wine. I don't know. Are they allowed to drink wine in heaven? I don't know. So there are some religions, though, where you can become enlightened that aren't Buddhist. At least in my opinion. It's just that, in my opinion, Buddhism is the most efficient way of doing that for certain kinds of people, especially if you're more head-oriented than, or you're mystically oriented maybe. But for people that need more devotionalism, they just have like this need for a more heart-based system. Maybe some other system would work better, like maybe Vedanta, some kind of Hinduism, maybe even like some kind of contemplative order of Christianity. But I do think that Buddhism, the Buddha, in a way, he engineered Buddhism to be as pure of a mystical system as possible. And it eventually got corrupted. A lot of extra stuff got added. Maybe some important stuff got subtracted. But there's less to distract you. There's less dogmatism to distract you, even though lots of dogmatism has been added to it. So I think it is the best system for cultivating wisdom, or at least in being charitable and open-minded and all. It's up at the top. It's in the top 3, top 2. Let's just say it's the best. It's the best system just for cultivating wisdom and getting you closer to enlightenment, but not for everybody necessarily. There's all different kinds of personality types, and one size does not fit all. Some people might just need a different, more heart-oriented approach or something. So all religions are not the same, but also I would say that Buddhism is not necessarily the only true path to Nibbana. That some people can become enlightened just because they're ripe. They're like the yellow leaf on the tree in late October that's just ready to fall. And all it takes is just some little nudge. And that's all it takes. It's like some people that they've done a lot of spiritual practice in previous lives, supposedly, or presumably. And then they get a blow on the head or something. They have some near-death experience, and that's all it takes. They don't necessarily have to be doing any intensive practice in this life. Ramana Maharshi was like that. He was a Hindu, but there's a good chance he was fully enlightened, even though he was a Shaivite Hindu who worshipped a hill. Life is strange. So let's see here. I guess I answered that question. So I'm going to move on to the next question here from Al Pacino Alpaca. And Al Pacino Alpaca says, maybe the ultimate formless consciousness is the reason why our universe exists at all. You cannot be just conscious. You are always conscious of something. If nothing exists and you are pure consciousness without body, thoughts, or even feelings, what would you be conscious of? Yeah, I mean, that's true. There has to be some kind of contrast in order to be conscious in the human sense. In order to have any kind of world, any kind of perceptible existence, there has to be a contrast between, something and something else. And if all there is just pure formless consciousness, then there's nothing there to be conscious of. And in a way, it doesn't even really exist. I mean, there's no way to identify it. It's like Hegel starts his dialectic, pure being is the first thesis. And then the first antithesis is pure non-being. And they just cancel each other out because neither one of them has any discernible content. And so they're indistinguishable. They just merge into each other. So then you have to have contrast as the synthesis, which then allows the entire universe to exist. It's like the Tao Te Ching, says, one came from the Tao, the two came from the one, and from the two came the 10,000 things, which is kind of a similar message. So let's see. I mean, what is the main question here, though? If nothing exists and you are pure consciousness without body, well, you wouldn't be you. I mean, there wouldn't be any you. I mean, pure consciousness, pure formless consciousness, I mean, that might be just God in a sense. I mean, if you're going to reify that and say that it's this thing, it's this entity, then yeah, that'd be capital G God, probably. Brahman. So let's see, if nothing exists and you are pure consciousness without body, well, I mean, the consciousness would exist, and so that would be something that exists. What would you be conscious of? Yeah, I mean, that's just it. So, yeah, from the Buddhist point of view, you have to be conscious of something, at least with regard to Vijnana Khandha, the aggregate of consciousness. That aggregate of consciousness has to be conscious of something, of some object. So when you get to just pure formless consciousness, there are one or two fragments of suttas in the Sutta Pitaka that are implying that that's what Nibbana is just pure formless consciousness. It's not you, it's not your consciousness. There is no you. But it's just that's what the Upanishads, some Upanishads also identify the absolute, Brahman as pure formless consciousness. So the objects are kind of optional and come later. And then that's like the fall from grace. That's the fool in the tarot deck falling off the cliff into the world. Once he becomes conscious of something, once something is singled out, then boom, you're in samsara. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Luigi Scarface, which is continuing the Pacino theme. And Luigi says, reading some suttas in the Pali canon, it speaks on angels wanting to feed the Buddha food through his pores and Gautama fighting the Buddhist devil and his hordes of demons. How does a 21st century Westerner take this seriously? Do you believe in this literally? Well, I mean, I would make this one little quibble. I don't think the Buddha was fighting the Buddhist devil and his hordes of demons. I mean, he was withstanding them. He was just sitting there in a state of contemplation while they're doing everything they can. He might rebuke Mara a little bit, but I mean, he's not hurling anything at them. He's not, doing any kind of martial arts against them or anything. Not using any weapons, really. But yeah, there is a lot of weird stuff. Like when the Buddha was starving himself, when he was doing his severe austerities before his enlightenment, that the devas, the small g gods, they didn't know what color his skin was. Some of them thought he was black, some thought he was brown, some thought he was golden colored. It was just, his skin was so discolored and dirty and mottled and everything. And he was so emaciated that they started thinking they were just going to like infuse some kind of celestial manna into him just to keep him alive. And this is all just later devotionalism that got added. It's not what the Buddha really taught, in my opinion. So no, I don't believe this literally. It really has nothing to do with what the Buddha really taught, which is how to become enlightened, how to cultivate wisdom, how to be mindful, how to have equanimity, fewness of desires, to know what causes suffering and how to avoid unnecessary suffering, that sort of thing. And all the stories and the fables and the fire-breathing dragons and so forth was added later. And any pre-modern system is going to have this kind of stuff. It's just the way pre-modern people thought. So, yeah, I guess I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to the next question from Santosh. And Santosh says, how to remember past lives as lay people without much experience in meditation. Well, you could try hypnotism, which is what my father did. My father claimed to remember a number of his past lives. As a little kid, I'd be sitting on his lap. He'd be telling me about past life regressions and astral traveling and so forth. And he wasn't much of a meditator, but he was an amateur hypnotist. And he was really into what he called the occult, or just, experimenting with, latent psychic abilities, ESP and dream communications, and trying to move objects without touching them and so forth. And so yeah, he did it through hypnosis. So that would be probably your best bet if you don't meditate well enough to have past life regressions. And I never had past life regressions in meditation anyway. So you'd have to be really adept and also just have a talent in that direction. But I think a lot of people who have past life regressions in meditation are really hypnotizing themselves anyway. So yeah, try hypnosis. That would be the obvious answer to that question. So I'll just move on to the next question, which is from White Ash Piper. And White Ash Piper says, could the only illusion be the eternal now? Thinking on your metaphor with the candle flame and the stream seems like the past is ever crashing into the future. What say you, Panyobasa? Well, yeah, I think it would probably be the other way around, really. The candle flame and the stream, you're talking about samsara, which is not ultimately real anyway. It's like like I was saying earlier, you have to have change in order to have any kind of conscious existence. Just because, any kind of stasis, anything staying the same, and the mind just doesn't change. It's just frozen. Literally frozen. So it's not, you wouldn't even be aware of it. There always has to be something changing in order for you to be aware, for you to be alive and a conscious being. So, but then this alive conscious being is not ultimately real. It's just one of an infinite number of possible statues contained in this block of marble. So, the eternal now, the only illusion? No, I don't think so. Now is, if you're in now, it's each moment is the only moment, so to speak. And the candle flames and the streams and all that they're objects of perception and samsaric and not ultimately real. So I guess I answered that question. It's a profound question. And so it causes me a little bit of emotional insecurity to have answered it so quickly, instead of just wallowing in answering the question for 5 or 10 minutes. But I'm going to move on to White Ash Piper's next question. And if he's really dissatisfied, he can ask it again in different words or something, like he has done before. So his next question is there a word for ego? So I assume he's referring to Pali. Is there a Pali word for ego? And I don't think there's any word in Pali that precisely corresponds to the ego as formulated by Sigmund Freud in his psychology. Although ego literally means I in Latin. And so Yeah, I mean, there's words for I, like aham in Pali. And so, I mean, you can say like asami mana might be a word that kind of comes close. It's like the conceit I am. In a way that's kind of like the ego. It's at least it's what the ego is based on. I mean, the ego is based on the idea that you are an individual entity, and it's all also based on perception. It's like your perceptions are, like, what am I trying to say here? That like the personification of who you are, in a sense. I mean, it's like you're turning your perceptions into an I. So, I mean, something like Sakaya Ditti, or personality view, would also be sort of a foundation of what Freud called the ego. But the conceit I am is like the foundation of it. It's like your conscious mentality with which you identify, I assume, would be what the ego really is. And so it'd be like asami mana, maybe. But I don't think there is a Pali term that precisely, directly corresponds to the ego in Freudian psychology. I mean, Buddhist psychology works different from Freud. Like, Buddhism, strangely, doesn't really have a concept of the subconscious mind, which I think is sort of maybe a defect in the later developments of Buddhist psychology. Like Abhidhamma. They really didn't have any concept of the latent subconscious. It's like mental processes that are going on that you're not consciously aware of, at least not at the level of the ego. So I do think that, I've had enough experience in life to know that there really is a subconscious mind. And so I do think that is one of the shortcomings of the Abhidhamma philosophy, is that it really didn't take that into account. It couldn't really explain a lot of things, like what generates dreams and so forth. They would just say, it's like your karma is generating the dream, but they can't really explain it much better than that. So, yeah, I guess I answered that question, sort of. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Josh. And Josh asks a kind of historical, interesting question. He says, why do you think Jainism continued to survive in India up to modern times, while Buddhism ended up dying out over the past several centuries? That's a good question. It's like, the Jains are still in India. The Buddhists got wiped out, but there's still a few million Jains, I have read. And I assume one reason why the Jains survived is they were just seen as unimportant and allowed to survive. Just, they were under the radar to some degree. They just looked like Hindus or something, maybe. But the Buddhists, because they were, India was majority Buddhist for quite a while. So that there was more of a pushback against the Buddhists. They were more obvious. They were like the prevailing religious system when the Muslims invaded. So they were like on the radar way more, and became more of a target, I think. And the dog's having a dream. Yeah. Silly. Okay. So, yeah, I assume that the Jains were just kind of under the radar, because they weren't really a major. There was lots of them, but they were so innocuous, and, they weren't really, I don't know how mainstream they would have been. Yeah, it is a good question, and I'm just guessing. I'm just coming up with hypotheses or theories or something. But I do think there was a certain rivalry between the Hindus and the Buddhists, not so much between the Jains and anybody. And so, it may have been a certain amount of karma just from the rivalry going on, that too much pushing wound up in too much pushing back the other way, or something. But it may also be that the Jains were more ascetic than the Buddhists, and so they were more likely to just be off in the woods somewhere, while the Turks were sacking the Buddhist universities. and just slaughtering the inhabitants of monasteries and so forth. The Jains were wandering around naked, just out in the sticks somewhere. So they may have survived in that way also. Kind of like one of the explanations for why the bhikkhunis went extinct. Bhikkhunis weren't allowed to live in the forest because it was just too dangerous for women. And so, they were in the towns and so forth where they were easier to wipe out. But I assume there were some Buddhists that were out in the woods too. But why they eventually became extinct, maybe it's just because the main centers of Buddhism collapsed. And so, it just gradually, the numbers of forest ascetic Buddhists also just kind of dwindled out because of the main support centers just getting wiped out by Muslims and to some degree by intolerant Hindus, like kings and so forth. So, and it could be, I've heard the theory that it's just the Buddhists were making bad karma for themselves by getting into all this esoteric tantra stuff. They were just getting farther and farther out, so that the lay people couldn't really relate to what it was that they were teaching or practicing or anything anymore. And it just became too heavily reliant on Buddhist universities. And so when the universities got wiped out, it was sort of like what happened to Buddhism in Thailand when the Burmese sacked their capital city, Ayutthaya, that Thailand never fully recovered from that. To this day, they still haven't fully recovered. The whole ecclesiastical hierarchy and their monastic schools and everything were centered in this city that just got essentially sacked. And that was on a much larger scale in India with regard to Buddhism in general. So again, I'm just coming up with theories. I've never really considered this question before, so I'm just guessing off the top of my head. So I'm just going to move on to Josh's next question. And he says, my second question is, do you know if anyone has made a chronological order of the suttas from the Pali canon, like from the moment of the Buddha's enlightenment to his parinibbana? That might be hard, though, considering how many suttas there are, but I think it would be interesting to be able to read at least some of the most famous and important ones in chronological order. Well, I don't think it's even really possible. With regard to the Quran, that some Western editions of the Quran have tried to put them in chronological order because, it's recent enough and well documented enough that you could do that. But with regard to the Pali suttas, like, for example, according to tradition, the very first sutta, the very first discourse of the Buddha was the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. But some Buddhist scholars like K.R. Norman point out that it's kind of like an anachronism in that some later Buddhist philosophy is already implied in that sutta. So it may just be like a traditional thing. It may not have really been the Buddha's first sermon. I'm not really taking sides on that one, but there's no way that you could come up with a chronological order of suttas, especially because a lot of the suttas probably were never taught by the Buddha anyway. And some of the suttas are just amalgams of older material. It's just fragments of older material that are all got compiled into one sutta. And it's just really hard to say. Like the Atthaka Vagga is considered to be extremely ancient, especially the 4 Attaka suttas of the Atthaka Vagga of the Sutta Nipata. Those could be some of the oldest suttas, and they're obviously archaic in certain respects, and they're teaching a very different kind of Buddhism than a lot of Buddhist suttas are. So, it's just the best you could do is just try to come up with just a rough approximation of what are the early texts. And like the book, I've already mentioned it, I mentioned it quite a lot actually, is Studies in the Origins of Buddhism by G.C. Pandey. And he goes through the Sutta Pitaka and he's trying to differentiate, the older material from the later material. And so something like that at least can get you sort of a little bit closer to understanding what the early teachings were. But it's so complicated, and there's just not enough information with regard to how to date the suttas that I don't think it's remotely possible to do that. I mean, you can maybe, I mean, even the traditionalists, like some Burmese scholar Sayadaw, there's no way he could do that either, because I mean, there's no mention in most of the suttas of exactly when the sutta was given, when the discourse was delivered. It's just, on one occasion, thus I have heard, on one occasion the Buddha was staying at such and such place, and it's not giving a date or anything. They didn't even have dates in those days. So yeah, I mean, it's not possible. So do I know if anyone has made a chronological order of the suttas from the Pali Canon? I assume there have been attempts at least, like G.C. Pandey in his book was at least trying to differentiate earlier from later, and that's about as good as you can do. Maybe you can differentiate it into better than just earlier and later, like really early, like the Attaka Vaga, especially the 4 Attaka Suttas, and you got like the central portion of the Sakapanya Sutta, you got the Rhinoceros Horn Sutta, the Daniya Sutta of the Suttanipata, maybe the Diganaka Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, and just fragments. I mean, sometimes you'll have an old fragment embedded in a later sutta, that kind of thing, with like some of it just being like commentary, or just a verse, and then you've got like this story that sort of like explains the verse, but the verse is maybe really ancient. Like the Udana, there's still a certain amount of disagreement, I think, with regard to which is older, the prose portion or the verse portion of the Udana. They just don't know. All you can do is just guess for various reasons. So yeah, I don't think I mean, according to tradition, it's like the first sutta was the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. The second sutta was the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, on the mark of no self. The third was the Fire Sutta, I think. And so, I mean, you can kind of get to the traditional view of the order of the earliest suttas by reading the Mahavaga of the Vinaya Pitaka. Because the Mahavaga of the Vinaya Pitaka starts with the Buddha's enlightenment and then continues as, he's giving his first discourses and then like starting the Sangha, like ordaining his first disciples and starting certain rules, like with regard to rains retreats, and just it gets more and more technical as you go along. But that would probably be the closest you're going to get from a traditional point of view would be to read, especially the first chapter of the Vinaya Mahavaga, which you can find free online. So I guess so. I guess I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Mogambo. Okay. This is from Mogambo. And he says, I've been listening to Khuddaka Nikaya lectures on YouTube. Whatever I've heard so far are stories about various people from all walks of life who have an ego or in the wrong some way, and Buddha just points out their faults and how to overcome it. So is the core of Buddhism just self-improvement? And nirvana, according to what I'm getting from these lectures, is just controlling one's emotional state of mind and not letting them slide into one extreme or the other. No, I mean, with regard to his teaching of lay people, like relative normies, he might just be teaching them how to be a better person, how to, how to avoid extremes, that sort of thing. But I mean, the whole purpose of Buddhism, the main purpose, is enlightenment, which is freedom from suffering or freedom from delusion. Take your pick, because they both wind up the same. So it may be that the lectures on YouTube are directed towards lay people that watch YouTube videos, so they might be just picking the ones that they think would be more applicable to normies sitting at home watching YouTube videos. That may be part of it. But if you read the texts, you read the suttas, you're going to see that, there's way more to Buddhism than that, and that's really not the main point of it. So I think I'm just going to move on to Mogambo's next question here. And he says, my question is about Zen and Mahayana. Are they both similar, or is Zen more close to Buddhism with emphasis on self-improvement in the present rather than attaining the nirvana which rest of the sects are trying to achieve? Well, Zen technically is a kind of Mahayana. Some people might separate Zen from Mahayana, but Zen really it's a sect of Mahayana Buddhism. So they are similar in that respect. Zen is more iconoclastic, it's less dogmatic, and it has more appreciation for meditation, and also it has more appreciation of the idea that thinking isn't going to get you there. That you're not going to understand reality by thinking about it. So that's why some Zen practitioners will meditate on koans, which is a riddle that has no answer, no correct answer. And you just keep stewing over it until finally it's like your mind just like hits tilt like an old pinball machine, or just the error light goes up and you stop thinking. And in that moment of clarity, when you stop thinking, then you can actually realize something. So let's see, are they both similar, or is Zen more close to Buddhism? I assume by Buddhism he means Theravada, because Zen and Mahayana are both technically schools of Buddhism or kinds of Buddhism. See, with emphasis on self-improvement. And again, ultimately, once you get to the advanced level, a monk is supposed to leave behind both good and bad. So the self-improvement is more a matter of not so much improving yourself. That's sort of for beginners. That's for lay people. Earning merit is for lay people. But when you start getting more advanced, it's more of just becoming more and more subtle, and just so that you can see through the veil, so to speak. So, in a way, it's all, the present moment is supposed to be the most important moment. There are a lot of Buddhists who are like praying for some future existence or something, which really is just radically different from what the Buddha was teaching. He was warning against that kind of stuff. So, goal-oriented Dhamma is not the best kind of Dhamma. And even setting up enlightenment or nirvana as a goal, it's pretty much unavoidable. It's like the ideal that you should be moving towards, but still you should be moving towards it while attending to what is right here, right now in the present moment. So the Buddha really didn't emphasize nirvana a lot. He had to mention it and, point out that that's the goal and everything, but really being mindfulness in the present moment is much more important than thinking about some future state that you haven't arrived at yet. That's just not a good way of making progress. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Rakasa. And this is another question about that same Mula Pariyaya Sutta, which is Sutta number 1 in the Majjhima Nikaya. And he says, my question concerns this passage from the Mula Pariyaya Sutta. Quote, he perceives Nibbana as Nibbana. Having perceived Nibbana as Nibbana, he conceives himself as Nibbana. He conceives himself in Nibbana. He conceives himself apart from Nibbana. He conceives Nibbana to be mine. He delights in Nibbana. Why is that? Because he has not fully understood it, I say. Unquote. So Rakasa's question is, how would someone who perceives Nibbana do any of that? My impression was that someone attains Nibbana by putting an end to ahamkara, or making me making. Otherwise, they simply do not perceive it. Perhaps I am mistaken, or Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation is off, But this passage makes it sound like you can attain Nibbana but not be liberated because you attain it by grasping and identifying. The rest of the sutta makes sense when talking about putujanas grasping at worldly elements, so I'm confused why the Buddha includes Nibbana. Well, if you read the sutta, you'll see that when he's talking about the normie, the putujana, the ordinary worldling, the common person, he perceives Nibbana as this or that. But when you get to the enlightened being, he's not perceiving Nibbana anymore. He is knowing directly Nibbana. So this perceiving Nibbana, perception is samsara. Perception is just symbols in your head. That's not really Nibbana. So you're thinking about Nibbana. That's not really Nibbana. And that's what he's talking about in this passage. He's thinking about Nibbana. There's some normie thinking about Nibbana. He makes all kinds of false assumptions about Nibbana, which, a lot of people do that. Most Buddhists have false assumptions about Nibbana because they think about it, but they haven't experienced it directly. So they're just coming up with ideas about Nibbana. And that's what this sutta, or what this passage is discussing. But then if you continue with the sutta, when you get to the enlightened being, you get to the Arahant and the Tathagata, then they know it directly. It's not perceiving anything anymore. The perception is the problem. Perception is just symbols in your head that people mistake for reality. But you're never going to understand reality. You're never going to understand Nibbana by perception. Perception is samsara. It's just symbolic meaning that you confuse with reality. So I hope I answered that question, because I'm moving on to the next one. And this is from Arain. And Arain says, how does one find an authentic teacher? Should junior monks be running around farming followers on social media and soliciting for cash donations? What are the rules of Vinaya with regard to this, and how should lay people take care not to be led astray when it comes to dana or support? Well, finding an authentic teacher is difficult because if you're looking for a teacher, that means that you are still unenlightened. You are to some degree delusional. And so you're having to use a delusional mind to pick a teacher. And history shows that a lot of people, probably most people, just pick a deluded teacher who maybe is a con man pretending to be enlightened, or is just pretending to be a wise person or whatever, wiser than the person really is. So that is really a dilemma. I did write an essay long ago on the dilemmas of religion. And I'm pretty sure that was one of the dilemmas where, you can go with your own idea, but you're going with a deluded idea if you're not enlightened yet, or you can follow a teacher's idea, but you got to use your deluded mind to pick a teacher. So you're just stuck with the delusion one way or the other. You're having to make a deluded choice one way or the other. Some people are just lucky they've got enough merit or enough purity of heart or something that the right teacher just comes to them. In fact, as a general rule, when the student is ready, the teacher will come. So there is that, but it is a dilemma. So I'll just move on to this next part of the question here. Should junior monks be running around farming followers on social media and soliciting for cash donations? What are the rules of Vinaya with regard to this, and how should lay people take care not to be led astray when it comes to dana or support? Well, there are a few things with regard to Vinaya. First of all, no monk should be asking for cash donations. If any monk is asking for donations, he's not following Vinaya. He has besmirched his virtue by doing so. So there is that. Also, a monk should not be a teacher until he has been a monk for at least 10 years. That's ancient Theravadan tradition, that especially your first 5 years as a monk, you're a beginner. You're a Navaka Bhikkhu. You're a beginner. You shouldn't be teaching anyone unless, people can come and ask you questions, that sort of thing. And you might still be humble enough to say, well, you should ask my teacher. He knows better than I do. But maybe, they just come out to your meditation cabin, they're sitting there talking, and they just ask you a question, what's your understanding? Your teacher says this, do you agree with that sort of thing? Or whatever. Would you explain the 5 precepts to me or something? Well, it makes sense for the monk to do the best he can, but for him to put himself out there, to hype himself as a teacher, when he's still a junior monk is inappropriate. I mean, that's not so good. They may have justifications for it. There's so little Dharma that, we're in need of people that can teach, and I can teach better than most or something. But yeah, I mean, there's no rules against farming followers on social media because, of course, in the Iron Age, Ganges Valley, they didn't have social media yet. They didn't have internet or anything back then. So, I mean, you're going to have to use what wisdom you've got to detect wisdom and or unwisdom in people who are putting themselves out there as teachers. So, yeah, I hope I didn't just lose half my viewers by saying that. But see, what are the rules of winning with regard to this, and how should lay people take care not to be led astray when it comes to dana or support? Well, be cautious and just watch the person. See, I mean, if they're a monk, I mean, do they follow the rules as well as you understand the rules? Most lay people don't understand the rules. Even in Burma, which is possibly the most Buddhist country in the world, a lot of people don't realize that monks are forbidden to touch money or women. There's so many monks, rascally monks on buses, like sitting next to girls and so forth, that people just don't realize that it's just strictly forbidden for a monk to be touching women or money. I mean, it's like even the Burmese equivalent of the Sangha Raja, the Sangha Mahanayaka Seattle. I'm pretty sure he asks for donations and handles money himself, or at least a relatively recent one did. And some of the most famous monks, most revered monks in the country, they're like demanding payment for giving Dhamma talks, that sort of thing. I mean, they're just raking it in with both hands. So you got to be careful. I mean, if you really want a monk who is virtuous, you should know a little bit about the rules of monastic discipline and take a look at the monk to see if he's following the rules of monastic discipline. And just know Dhamma well enough to have an idea as to whether these teachers are following Dhamma and whether they are practicing it and whether they really understand it. But again, ideally, a teacher is going to know more than you do. So, I mean, if you can verify everything that he says, then he's not a very good teacher because, I mean, you know as much as he does, if not more. So really, the whole thing is, to some degree, you just have to be very sensitive and cautious and, give a teacher the benefit of the doubt. I mean, you don't want to be so cynical that you just assume that they're all full of shit or something. Because, I mean, that's just slamming the door from the very get-go, and you're not going to get much benefit from that. So give them the benefit of the doubt, but, I mean, if alarm bells start ringing, they're doing something that strikes you as being foolish or unvirtuous or inappropriate or whatever, then, yeah, I mean, you should take that into consideration and think twice before sending them the contents of your bank account. And if they're asking for money just flat out, then you know that they're not virtuous monks, at least not Theravada monks. A Theravada monk is forbidden to tell anybody what to do with money other than just do whatever makes you happy. And, they're not allowed to handle it, not allowed to ask for it, anything like that. But I mean, if a monk or a nun, any kind of teacher, if they cause you to make improvement, they're helping you. They make you feel like happier or wiser, like you feel like you're really getting benefit from it, then yeah, go with that. And just continue giving them the benefit of the doubt until they give you really obvious reasons not to. I mean, or you got to trust your intuition to some degree. So it'd be like the same as making any kind of important decision. You wait until you're like in a relatively expanded, clear kind of mental state, and then see what kind of intuition comes up. What is the decision that comes up from deep inside you, rather than just your superficial thinking mind, something like that. And have faith that, I mean, if you really are in need of a teacher, then the teacher will find you. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is the very last question. This is from Rybalder, I think. Ribalder. Something like that. Anyways, Ribalder says, thank you for the explanation. I'm not sure what the explanation was, but I explained something apparently, which is good. And he says, what name is given, if any, to that which transmigrates lifetimes? What element is undergoing rebirth? And this is an easy question to answer, because the only thing that transmigrates, the only thing that you take with you after you die, is karma. That's it. That's the only thing. There is no soul that transmigrates in Burma. In Buddhism, it's just your karma, and your karma is essentially what Schopenhauer called will. It is volition, it is cetana, and it's like the momentum, like the kinetic aspect of your mind. Like perceptions are more like static symbols, but the volition or the cetana is like the kinetic aspect. It's like the energetic aspect of your mind. It's determining your direction. It's the momentum of your mental states. And that is what, when this vehicle stops working, then immediately it has to find another vehicle, because it's sort of like conservation of energy kind of a deal. So it's karma, or will, is the only thing that is undergoing rebirth. And that's it. That's the last question. So if you got any questions that you think maybe I can answer, like especially about Buddhism or meditation or monasticism or anything you think I might know something about, then feel free to ask them their questions in the comments below, or if you have access to Subscribe Star, you can ask there. If you have access to the Discord server, you can ask there. And I won't tell you to look at the links below, because YouTube, I'm pretty sure, is still smiting me. I think it's like 2 months before I can post links again. But yeah. And I guess the last thing I'm supposed to say is be happy. So be happy.